The early morning air was still cool as Malik and his young son, Amir, walked down the busy street toward their usual cafe. It was a simple routine they had, something to start their day right. Malik, a hardworking single father, always made sure to carve out time for moments like these, where he could bond with his son before the hustle of the day took over. They had their favorite spot, a small corner cafe with large windows where they could watch the world move around them, sipping their coffee and talking about anything and everything. But today, something felt different. Malik couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a quiet tension in the air. The usual hum of the neighborhood, the chatter of people going about their day, felt somehow off. As they stepped inside the cafe, Malik noticed a man sitting at the counter, a uniformed police officer, his eyes scanning the room with a disapproving stare. The officer's gaze lingered on Malik and Amir for a moment too long, before quickly moving away. Malik felt the flicker of unease stir inside him, but he pushed it aside. Maybe it was just his imagination, or maybe the officer was just having a bad day. The father and son walked up to the counter, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Malik ordered his usual, a strong black coffee, and Amir, who had recently become obsessed with trying new drinks, asked for something a bit more adventurous. A caramel latte with extra foam. Malik smiled at his son's enthusiasm, the boy's innocence always bringing a sense of warmth to his heart. He glanced back at the officer who had shifted in his seat, staring at them with an almost unnatural intensity. Malik wasn't one to make waves, but today, there was something about this officer that rubbed him the wrong way. "Here you go," the barista said, handing Malik his coffee, and Amir's latte was placed beside it. Malik nodded in thanks and turned to leave, when suddenly the officer stood up. His eyes locked on Malik, and he took a step forward. "Hey," the officer called out, his tone cold and condescending. "You know, we don't like your kind hanging around here." Malik's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if he had heard right. Did the officer just say what he thought he did? Amir, sensing his father's unease, took a step closer to him. "I'm sorry," Malik said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "What did you say?" The officer smirked, his expression darkening. "You heard me. You don't belong here. Just like the rest of them." The blood rushed to Malik's face as a wave of anger mixed with disbelief washed over him. He could feel his pulse in his temples, but he forced himself to stay calm. He looked down at Amir, who was standing quietly beside him, trying to make sense of the situation. Malik took a deep breath. "You don't know who I am, Theo?" The officer chuckled, a cruel and mocking sound. "Yeah, I know exactly who you are. And I know people like you. You don't get to just waltz in here like you own the place." Malik's hand tightened around the cup of coffee he had just picked up, his knuckles white. He could feel the heat of the liquid, but it was nothing compared to the rising heat inside him. He knew that if he didn't walk away now, things could escalate quickly. But as he turned to go, the officer's next words cut through the air. "You think you're special just because you walk around with that chip on your shoulder, just like your people." The words were vile, dripping with racism. Malik stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat, and for a split second, he felt like he had been hit by a freight train. This wasn't just some random act of ignorance. This was targeted, this was deliberate. He felt Amir's hand gently tugging at his sleeve, the boy's confused eyes looking up at him. "Dad, who is he?" Malik tried to keep his voice calm, despite the fury building inside him. He looked down at Amir and then back at the officer. "I'm not going to let you talk like that to me or my son." But before he could say anything else, the officer's expression twisted into something darker, more dangerous. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Malik's mind raced. He had to protect Amir. He had to keep his son safe, no matter what. Without warning, the officer grabbed Malik's coffee cup and hurled it toward him, the hot liquid splashing across Malik's chest and face. The burn was immediate, searing into his skin, but it wasn't the pain that hit him the hardest, it was the shock. The officer had done it in front of his son, in front of everyone in the cafe. The room fell silent. For a moment, Malik stood frozen, his chest stinging, his heart pounding in his ears. But in that split second, something inside him snapped. He could feel the rage rising, not just for himself but for his son, for every person who had ever been subjected to this kind of hatred. His body shook with the weight of it. Then, the unexpected happened. The door to the cafe swung open with a sharp bang, and in walked two more figures. Men in suits, walking with a calm confidence that immediately commanded attention. Malik recognized them instantly. They were FBI agents. They didn't hesitate. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, strode directly toward the officer, his presence overwhelming. The officer took a step back, clearly intimidated by the sudden appearance of the agents. Malik, still stunned, couldn't help but feel a rush of relief, even though the situation was still far from over. "I suggest you step away from the gentleman," the agent said, his voice smooth but firm. The officer froze, looking from Malik to the agents, clearly unsure of how to react. Malik stood silently, still reeling from the moment. "You're under arrest," the agent continued, now pulling out his badge, "for assaulting an officer of the law." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The officer's face turned pale, his bravado melting away. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. The agent placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the door. Malik watched, his heart still racing, as the officer was led out of the cafe, the entire room now watching in stunned silence. Amir looked up at his father, his eyes wide with confusion. "Dad, what just happened?" Malik took a moment to collect himself. Wiping the burn on his face, still in shock from what had just occurred, he looked at his son, trying to find the right words, but in that moment, there was nothing he could say to make it all okay. But one thing was clear: the officer had made a grave mistake. The man he had just insulted, the man he had humiliated, was no ordinary person. Malik wasn't just a father trying to protect his son, he was a trained FBI agent, part of a force that stood against corruption, abuse, and injustice. The twist was unimaginable. The question now wasn't just how Malik would handle the situation, it was what would happen next. The officer had no idea who he had crossed paths with. And as Malik and Amir left the cafe, still processing the chaos that had just unfolded, one thing was certain: the story was far from over. The real repercussions were only just beginning. As Malik and Amir stepped out of the cafe, the world outside seemed to stand still for a moment. The early morning light felt harsher now, almost too bright for what had just unfolded. The sound of footsteps on the pavement seemed distant as Malik's mind raced. He glanced down at Amir, whose face was still filled with confusion. His son had seen the officer throw the coffee at him, but there was so much more beneath the surface that Amir couldn't possibly understand. How could he explain to the boy that the world was sometimes unfair, that even though they lived in a country that promised equality, people like them, black men, were often treated as less than? Malik felt the weight of that burden settle heavily on his shoulders. He had been trained to face danger, to confront the threats that lurked in the shadows of society. But he had never imagined that something like this could happen to him, in broad daylight, with his son right there beside him. He was no stranger to the cruelty of prejudice, having experienced it in various forms over the years. But this was different. This wasn't just a random incident, it was a blatant act of aggression from someone who had sworn to protect and serve. As they walked down the street, Malik's mind kept returning to the moments before the coffee was thrown. The officer's words were still ringing in his ears, each one more hateful than the last. He thought about what would have happened if the FBI agents hadn't shown up when they did. Would he have been dragged into a confrontation that could have escalated into something worse? Or worse yet, would Amir have seen his father hurt by someone who was supposed to be a symbol of safety and justice? The FBI agents, who had come in so swiftly and decisively, had been the unexpected twist Malik hadn't seen coming. But even though their arrival had been a relief, it also brought with it a new set of questions. Who were these agents? What was their interest in him? Did they know something he didn't? And most importantly, why had they been there at that exact moment? Malik didn't have answers to any of these questions, and the uncertainty gnawed at him as he and Amir returned to their small apartment. As they walked inside, Malik set his keys down on the kitchen counter, his body still tense from the encounter. Amir, noticing the quiet seriousness in his father's posture, finally spoke. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" Malik turned to face him, his heart breaking at the innocence in his son's voice. Amir wasn't fully aware of the danger that lurked just beneath the surface of their daily lives. He didn't know what it meant for his father to walk through the world as a black man, always carrying the weight of being judged and scrutinized by those who didn't understand him. Malik had worked hard to shield his son from these harsh realities, but today, Amir had been thrust into them headfirst. "We'll be okay, son," Malik said, his voice firm but lacking conviction. The truth was, he didn't know if they would be. This incident wasn't just about the officer's behavior, it was about a larger systemic issue that had been festering for far too long. And Malik knew that if he didn't take action, if he didn't stand up for himself, for his son, and for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system, nothing would change. Later that day, Malik received a call from one of the FBI agents he had seen at the cafe. The agent, whose name was Robert, introduced himself with a calm, professional tone. "Mr. Thompson, we need to speak with you. It's about the officer who harassed you earlier. We have reason to believe he's involved in something much larger than what you experienced today." The words hit Malik like a thunderclap. He had been expecting some kind of follow-up, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. "What do you mean?" Malik asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The agent's response was brief, but it carried the weight of something much bigger. "We've been investigating this officer for a while. His actions today may be tied to a larger pattern of misconduct within the department. We need your help to gather information." Malik's mind raced. He had known for years that corruption and racism ran deep within certain parts of law enforcement, but hearing it so directly was another thing entirely. The officer who had treated him and Amir with such disdain was now part of a much more dangerous and insidious problem. Malik couldn't help but wonder how many others had been hurt by this man and his colleagues, how many lives had been destroyed by the abuse of power that was now being uncovered. "Do you want me to go to the station, or should I meet you somewhere?" Malik asked, his mind already racing with the possibilities of what could come next. Robert's voice was calm but serious. "We'll arrange a meeting. We'll need to move quickly. The longer this man remains in his position, the more harm he can do, but we need to be careful. If he knows we're onto him, things could get dangerous for both you and your son." The tension in the air thickened as Malik processed the agent's words. He was about to be pulled into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Something that would put not only his life at risk, but Amir's as well. He had always known there were forces at work in the world that sought to keep people like him down. But this was a different kind of fight. This wasn't just about a single officer. It was about a system that protected the corrupt and punished the innocent. That evening, Malik lay awake in bed, unable to shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. The decision to get involved was not an easy one. He could walk away, forget the whole thing, and continue living his life as if nothing had happened. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the right choice. He couldn't let this man, or the system he represented, get away with what they had done. And as much as he wanted to protect Amir from the harsh realities of the world, he knew that sometimes the only way to protect your loved ones was to stand up and fight. But Malik also knew that this was not going to be an easy fight. He would have to walk a fine line between protecting his family and exposing the corruption that ran deep in the system. And with the officer now under investigation, Malik couldn't help but wonder how far the web of corruption went, and if he was ready to face it. The tension between him and the world outside continued to build, each moment carrying more weight than the last. As the investigation continued to unfold, Malik would be forced to make decisions that would change everything. Would he expose the truth, no matter the cost? Or would he risk everything to protect his son from the darkness that was closing in around them? The questions loomed larger with every passing day. And as Malik looked at Amir, who was peacefully sleeping beside him, he knew that whatever came next, it would be a fight worth fighting. The following days were a whirlwind for Malik. The weight of what he had agreed to was slowly sinking in, and with it, the realization that his life would never be the same. Every conversation with Robert, the FBI agent, carried an undercurrent of urgency and danger. They had to move carefully, quietly, or they risked alerting the corrupt officers to their investigation. Every move they made felt like it was under a microscope, every step calculated. Malik couldn't help but feel the pressure of knowing that not only his future but his son's safety was on the line. Meanwhile, the tension between Malik and the system was growing. The officer who had thrown the coffee at him was still out there, though his actions had been placed under intense scrutiny, but it wasn't just him. Malik began to uncover the far-reaching web of corruption that existed within the local police department. The officer wasn't acting alone. He was part of a group, a network of officers who had been using their positions to exploit the community for years. The more Malik learned, the more dangerous the situation became. He could feel the walls closing in. One evening, as Malik was going over documents with Robert in a safe house provided by the FBI, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his neighbor, someone he had known for years. The message was short but chilling. Stay inside. They know about you. Malik's heart dropped. His first instinct was to grab Amir and leave, but there was no time. He knew they had been under surveillance, but this was different. They were no longer just watching him. They were moving in. He had no idea how much time they had before things escalated. Robert had just finished explaining some new intel when Malik stood up abruptly. They know. They're coming for us. Robert's face darkened. We need to get you and your son out of here now. Malik didn't hesitate. He grabbed Amir's hand, and the two of them rushed out of the safe house. The FBI had set up a series of escape routes in case something like this happened, and they moved quickly through the back alleys, using every shortcut they could find. But even as they ran, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every shadow felt like it was a threat, every noise like it was a sign of something worse to come. As they neared a quiet street where they were supposed to meet another agent, Malik's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail from the same neighbor. The voice on the other end was frantic. Malik, they're here. They got your house. They're looking for you and Amir. You need to get out now. A chill ran down Malik's spine. The feeling of being hunted was something he had always feared, but now it was real. He could almost feel the weight of the officers closing in on him, the corrupt power making them feel invincible. But he wasn't going to go down quietly. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. As they turned a corner, a black SUV screeched to a stop in front of them. Malik's heart raced as the doors flew open, but to his surprise, it wasn't the officers he feared. It was Robert and another agent, who quickly ushered him and Amir into the car. Where are they? Malik asked, his voice tight. They're coming. But we got a plan. Robert replied, his voice grim. We need to end this now. We got enough on the officer's corruption to bring him down. The agents sped through the city streets, their destination clear. They were going to confront the officers head-on, expose them for the danger they posed to the community. Malik could feel the stakes rising with every passing second. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the truth being revealed, about justice being served. When they arrived at the police station, it was chaos. The corrupt officers had been tipped off, and they were trying to cover their tracks, erasing evidence, wiping their phones. Malik's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped out of the car, flanked by FBI agents. He was about to walk into the lion's den, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He knew that this was his moment to finally take a stand, to protect his son and the community from the corruption that had festered for far too long. The confrontation was swift. FBI agents stormed into the station, taking control and arresting the officers involved. The officer who had thrown the coffee at Malik was among them, his face pale as he realized the full extent of the investigation that had been unraveling. Malik stood at the back of the room, watching it all unfold. His body was still tense, his muscles tight with the anticipation of what was to come. But as he saw the corrupt officers being led out in cuffs, a sense of relief washed over him. This chapter was finally coming to an end. The officer who had humiliated him and Amir now stood powerless, his badge and authority stripped away. Malik felt a moment of vindication, but also a deep sadness. The damage had been done, and no arrest or conviction could take away the pain they had caused. The system had failed them once, but Malik wasn't going to let that happen again. In the weeks that followed, Malik worked closely with the FBI to ensure that the corruption within the department was fully exposed. The investigation led to more arrests, and the community began to heal, slowly but surely. The officers involved in the corruption were held accountable, and Malik's bravery in standing up to them was recognized by his colleagues at the FBI. But even as justice was served, Malik knew that the fight wasn't over. The road to change was long, and it wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed corruption to thrive. But for now, Malik could breathe a little easier. Amir was safe, and the truth had come to light. As the sun set one evening, Malik sat on the porch with Amir, watching the world go by. The quiet was a stark contrast to the chaos they had endured. But in that silence, Malik found peace. He had fought for his son's future, and though the battle was far from over, he knew that he had taken the first step toward change. The last thing he said to Amir before they went inside was simple, but it carried a weight of truth that would stay with them both forever. You may face challenges in life, son. People may try to hold you back, but never forget that the power to change things lies in your hands. Always stand up for what's right. And as they closed the door behind them, the world outside seemed just a little bit brighter.